Yeshiva League Pass Faceoff. I'm your host, Josh Kass, and we're back for the fifth time this season. Before we get into the show, though, I want to remind you all who we're sponsored by, and that's the Weiselberg Law Firm. For 16 years, you've entrusted Elliot with the growth and guidance of your kids, and now it's time to let him do the same for your family's most important asset, your home. Admitted in both New York and New Jersey, Elliot can help guide you through any residential or commercial purchase, sale, refinance, or lease with championship quality and award-winning care. If you're looking for your commercial coach or a new home is your goal, please reach out to the Weiselberg Law Real Estate Services today. You can get in contact with them by dialing 917-952-2597, or you can send them an email at wiselawsk@gmail.com. Reminding everyone once again, that's the Weiselberg Law Firm. Please choose wisely. So today, we're going to go a little bit shorter than we have in the past, and because the season has been over for quite some time, just haven't really had a lot of time to be able to get this done. We are going to talk about the recap, and we are going to talk about the JV season in particular today. So we'll start by going over the standings. So again, we had a total this year of 9 teams, and the way the schedule worked out was that each team played every other team once, and that amounted to a total of 8 games, and then played 2 different teams twice. So the standings stood as follows. Again, we had SAR in first, DRS in second, Hafter in third, YDE in fourth, Frisch in fifth, MTA sixth, Ramaz seventh, TABC eighth, Rambam in ninth. And just to remind everyone, those were the regular season standings. Those were not necessarily the overall seeds and the way they fell out after the playoffs, the championship, all that stuff occurred. So just to recap again, those were the regular season standings. In terms of the way the actual result of the season took place, we had SAR winning the championship, DRS falling in the championship, and then obviously want to shine some light on the other couple teams that made the playoffs, Hafter and Frisch making it to the semifinals, as well as YDE, who made it to the wild card game, so to speak. They played against Frisch for an opportunity to go to the semifinal. That would have been against SAR. So with that being said, that is where we ended up with, and that is really the way everything sort of unfolded as the season progressed, other than the standings themselves and what the actual results of the regular season were. So what we're going to do is we're going to break this up into 3 categories. You guys might remember that at the start of the regular season, we broke these teams up into categories of how we would predict they would finish and sort of what we thought would occur for them in the regular season and maybe even in the playoffs, going, a little bit down the road, a bit farther than maybe we needed to before any team had played a game. And now what we're going to do is we're going to sort of reevaluate where we had all of these teams and see just how accurate these predictions necessarily were or how far off they really were. So we're going to start with the following. I guess we'll work our way from the bottom up. So first of all, we'll go based on the way it seeded in the regular season. Rambam in last. Rambam went 0-10, didn't win a game, and as not necessarily predicted, I don't think anyone ever thought in their right mind this team wasn't going to win a game, because they did have some really good players on this team and definitely a recipe for ways they could have won games. It just didn't come together. This was not a deep team. They were not a lot of guys in general. They had some talent. Moshe Holzer, Moshe Feldman, Ilan Klein were guys who stepped up, Isaac Masry as well. They had some young goaltending. They had Solmani in net. He was a 9th grader, not so much experience there. So with that being said, there really wasn't a lot to look for on this team in terms of bodies, but they had a lot of potential. They just couldn't cross wins or they couldn't put wins on the board when it came to that. But again, as mentioned, they had some really good individual players, and obviously it's tough when you go 0-10, but a lot of these guys really were getting their first opportunity to play. Not a lot of players on this team in general, as I mentioned. Certainly, though, even the 10th graders, I think there were only 4 10th graders on this team. Granted, there weren't so many players as a whole, but younger team, and I would expect them to come back stronger next year. Second, I don't know how shocking it would necessarily be when you hear the school, though, of TABC. TABC finished in 8th place. They went 2-5-1-2 during the regular season. Now, they were competitive in almost every single game. And you look at it the way they played against teams like DRS and SAR and Frisch. They tied Frisch and lost to Frisch. Frisch was a team that made it to the semis. They lost 1-0 to SAR, the team that won it all. They had a 2-0 lead against DRS in DRS during the regular season. And unfortunately, they gave up 3 unanswered and they couldn't close it out. Against SAR, a couple close games there. They were really right there with every team. They just had a little bit of difficulty playing a full 36 minutes. Some of their games went to overtime, and, if necessary, then they went to overtime because obviously they tied 2 games and they also lost a game in overtime. But with that being said, this team has a lot of promise in terms of what they can have for next year. This was also very similar to Rambam. This was a younger team. There was not a lot of 10th grade bodies on this team, or there were not a lot of 10th grade bodies on this team, at least, that got so much time from last year's JV team and weren't really used to playing such heavy minutes. So when they had to step up into really big scenarios this year, obviously their TABC, it's always been their narrative. They're going to put out a powerhouse of a team, or at the very least, their teams are going to be competitive. And if they're not going to show it record-wise, they're going to show it heart-wise, which they did. The real issue is that they just had some trouble closing games out, because otherwise you're looking at a team. I said they went 2-5-1-2. This is a team that could have legitimately gone 7-1-2 instead. And that's really where you look at it. You look at a game, 2 games against Frisch. You look at a game against DRS. That right there is 3 wins right there. And, going to overtime, going into ties, a game against Ramaz, I know they ended up tying in YDE, a big game in overtime. Those are games all right there they could have put in the win column. And that right there is 4 or 5 extra wins for them, makes them go up from 2 to 6 or 7. And, that's really just what their issue was. But as I said, they've got a lot of promise going into next year. This was a younger team. They got a lot of big contributions, even despite the lack of production, so to speak, that their record indicated, from 9th grade players who played big roles. Word on the street is they'll have a good freshman class coming in next year. I would expect them to be a very, very threatening team next year, and not one that you can hold this narrative for what happened this year over them and say, oh, this is the first time in TABC history they didn't make the playoffs, which is true, but it's 1 year. Eventually, it's got to happen to everyone. And with that being said, I wouldn't think too deep on it. I think they'll be back here next year stronger than they were for sure. Moving on to number 3, or I guess the bottom 3rd team, that would be Ramaz. Ramaz did not have a very pleasant ending last year. They only played 1 or 2 games last year on their JV level, and their school decided, or I don't remember if it was entirely on their school, but their team forfeited the rest of their season. So JV did not end up finishing their regular season. They forfeited. I believe that they had played MTA twice, and both games that they played counted towards the teams they had played records. So I believe MTA actually squeaked away with 2 wins as a result, but all the other games were forfeited and the schedule was readjusted. And that was sort of what really, I don't want to say set the expectations coming in this year for them to not necessarily be a top team in the league, but not many people really had an idea of just how much of a threat this team was going to be to the rest of the teams on the JV level. And to some extent, it actually worked as an advantage to them. I know they didn't qualify for the playoffs. They only finished with a 3-6-0-1 record, and that was only 7 points, considering that, Frisch was the last seeded team that made it in. They had 10 points on the regular season. All things considered, it was a much better season for Ramaz this year than it was last year. Obviously, I know it's tough to really have a worse result when you have to forfeit the rest of your season, but it's not always in the case that team is necessarily bad. Maybe they didn't have enough bodies and they couldn't consistently get enough guys, enough nights to field a team out there. So it's very complicated. And for them to come back, and sort of really erase the narrative. And I know I said they went 3-6-0-1, which wasn't great. They were the 3rd worst team record-wise in the league. They were able to stick very similarly with TABC. They were able to stick with a lot of the other teams, top teams around the league in the standings, SAR, DRS, Hafter. They played tight with just about everyone. And to see them go 3-6-0-1, considering some of these teams were so far above the class or above in the class than other teams, but they still played a competitive season after having forfeited the remainder of their season last year on the JV level. And these guys didn't really have so much experience coming into it. I would say that's, definitely a much larger improvement than most other people probably would. And I will, I would definitely expect that next year, because they were also a younger team, that next year they will be, assuming that they end up putting a team together, they will be in the mix for teams that could definitely make a run, go deep in the playoffs. And who knows, maybe they'll win a championship on the JV level. That moves us on to the next team in the standings, going from the bottom up. So the team that finished in 6th place would be MTA. MTA last year, or rather not last year, as in this past year, but the season before this past season, made it to the playoffs, and they got a little bit, I don't know if I would say they got sort of surprised in the matchup they faced, but I would say that they, maybe for the expectations that, considering they played in the tougher division during the regular season, that maybe they underperformed a little bit. And they lost to North Shore. And they said, you know what, though, that was also a younger team. They had some very good 10th graders on that team, but most of the core made up from 9th graders on that team. And this year they were all 10th graders. And people said, okay, you know what, I think this is a team that that they'll make the playoffs. And they finished a point out of the playoff race. They finished with 9. The number they had to break, or the number they had to hit rather, was 10. So they just missed it by a hair. They went 4-5-1 on the regular season. They didn't tie a game. That one was an overtime loss. But if you're looking at it again, they played some close games, and they also had some surprising wins. Most notably, I want to point out the win they had against the Hafter Hawks in Hafter during the regular season. That was just a lot of people were really shocked when MTA went into Hafter and beat them there. And I really don't think it's as crazy as people think, considering the fact that Hafter didn't have a JV team last year. Obviously, all their guys were on the varsity team getting experience there. So, it made sense why they were such a powerhouse this past year on the JV level. We'll get to them, very soon. But with that being said, a lot of people were shocked about the fact that MTA goes into Hafter, beats them there, and let alone shuts them out. They win that game 1-0. Ozzie Dreyfus, MTA's goalie, had a performance of his life. And it was absolutely incredible. I was watching that game on the live stream, just thinking about how many chances, were going both ways. I know I said Ozzie Dreyfus played the game of his life. I also want to give credit to Matty Blonder, who played a heck of a game for Hafter on that side. But, at the end of the day, MTA was a team that, although they didn't make the playoffs and they just barely missed out, that they were able to punch teams in the mouth at times. They were not a team that went away easily. And I think that's really the common denominator here for even the teams that didn't make the playoffs, is they all played competitive games. It was really just a matter of not being able to find that extra bounce, or not finding enough of those extra bounces when they needed it most to translate to the win column for them, or at least gaining some sort of traction in the standings, whether it be also in overtime losses or ties, and at least getting a point out of that, because MTA fell just a point short of the playoffs with 10, or rather with 9, excuse me. And the team right above them that we're about to talk about, which is Frisch, finished in 5th place with 10. So on to Frisch. Frisch finished with the lowest record of all the teams that, or I don't know about the lowest record, but the lowest amount of points amongst the teams that made the playoffs. However, Frisch did not end up being the first team eliminated. They were one of the 4 teams that went straight to the semifinal, or not straight to the semifinals, but made it to the semifinals within the 5 teams that all had an opportunity to. So Frisch plays YDE in the quarterfinals, or rather what normally would be the quarterfinals this year happened to be more of a wild card game for that final spot in the semis. And Frisch and YDE had gone back and forth. YDE had the win over them earlier on in the regular season. And, if you were Frisch, I said on the podcast episode when I was talking about playoff predictions that, if you're Frisch, you could say, you know what, though, we know what they did to us earlier on. We know how we'll capitalize on our mistakes from last time, or how we can take away from what we made mistakes from last year, make sure we don't make those mistakes again, look at some of the mistakes maybe that YDE made and capitalize on those if they make those mistakes again, and did advance to the semifinals. And throughout the regular season, they were a really, really solid team. Through 10 games, they only went 4-4-0-2, but again, they were also in just about every single game. 2 tight games with TABC. I know they didn't make the playoffs, but they played competitively with everyone. Tight game with DRS during the regular season, couple tight ones with SAR, including the playoffs. If you want to talk about the semifinals, they lost just 1-0 in SAR. They were really, really solid. They also played competitively with Hafter. This was a team that, despite only winning 4 games, they first of all made the playoffs. Second of all, made it to the semifinals. And third of all, like one bounce, as I'll talk about when I talk about SAR at the very ending, because they were the 1 seed, one bounce, and they could have been the ones in the championship over SAR. And, when we talk about that, you'll realize how crazy that really is, just in terms of the stats to it. So with that being said, again, Frisch fell short of their goal winning the championship, but certainly a respectable regular season from them, excuse me. And on top of that, also a young core there. They were led by some real nice young pieces, Charlie Butler, as well as Sammy Perlman. And those are 2 guys right there on both the offensive and defensive side of things that are really going to be able to, those 2 guys right there are the 2 guys I'm looking at for them next year if I'm Frisch's coach. And I'm saying these are going to be my 2 horses, one offense, one defense. And, these are the 2 guys that are going to be the guys that I build around. Also want to give a shout out to Ryan Teller, who sort of was a little bit underappreciated in the mix or not mentioned as much. And also some 10th graders on that team like Albie Hornblast and Howie Rudolph, who were helping as well from, so to speak, the veteran perspective as the 10th graders who really made significant impacts on that team. We're going to move on to YDE now. YDE did not make the playoffs last year, or rather before the season before this past year. I know it's tough terminology to go because the season's over. But either way, YDE, 6-4 record during the regular season. They made it to the wild card game, hosted the wild card game against Frisch. Unfortunately, it did not end well for them. They lost. However, you do have to give this team a lot of credit. And at the end of the day, considering they didn't make the playoffs the season before this past season, there was a lot, not a lot necessarily, but I think it would be fair to say most people did not anticipate this team doing really anything. But they ended up getting a shot in the arm from some of the guys who were coming up from the 8th grade team in middle school in their season prior, who also they didn't go to the semis in this year's JV season, but when they were in middle school, went to the semis, guys like Steven Franco and Alan Fallis. Those were 2 guys right there. Again, similar to I mentioned Sammy Perlman and Charlie Butler on the offensive and defensive side for Frisch, amongst freshmen who made impact. Those were 2 freshmen right there for YDE, and Fallis and Franco, who both made immediate impacts. Fallis on the defensive side, and Franco, obviously, everyone knew he was going to be a huge, huge goal scorer for YDE coming in on the offensive side of things for the JV level. And this is a team that's interesting to watch going forward. They don't necessarily have those big, bright names really, other than a guy like the Fouls and Francos of the world. However, they play, I would say, some of the best team hockey I've seen, certainly throughout all my years playing Yeshiva League and watching it after finishing my time as a player, that I've seen in a long, long time, if not ever, because this is a team, and it's always been a team, and rather I should say it's always been a school that doesn't always necessarily have the most talented and skilled players, but they all play with a ton of heart, and every single player gives just as much as the next guy. They're all always given 100%, never an easy task. And they've really changed the culture, because when YDE first started playing in the league, they were not known so much to be a hockey school, but they've certainly turned that around. And I'm very interested to see what they do going forward, especially next year in their sophomore years, already having a year of experience under their belt, where they already really made great, great strides and really took this league by surprise. Next year, they'll be more experienced. They'll be on the older side, and they'll be the ones who everyone is looking at now to see, okay, like, what, are these 2 guys going to lead YDE farther than they went last year? How can they do it? What sort of changes could we potentially see? And can YDE get back to being a top team in the league like they were a couple of years before a little bit of a drop off? Anyway, let's move on to the 3rd best team record-wise during the regular season in the league, and that is the Hafter Hawks. Hafter actually had the same record as YDE. They finished 6-4. However, they did have the tiebreaker over YDE due to the regular season standings and the matchups they played against them. So Hafter gets the 3 seed over YDE. They go straight to the semifinals, and they play against the DRS Wildcats. First of all, other than the fact that was an incredible game, I was there to witness it, goes to overtime. Unfortunately, Hafter did not make it to the championship, and their season ended in the semifinals. But on the road in DRS, a team that people thought, including myself, would probably take that game a little bit easier than they actually did. I have to give them credit. And, I definitely regret to some extent making the prediction I made because they really played a heck of a game that game. And then I also want to talk about what they had during the regular season. This was probably, I would say, the first or the second really great mix of freshman contributors as well as sophomore contributors. On the sophomore side, everybody knew about Zachy Weiss. Everybody knew about Matty Blonder coming back into the play. Everybody knew about the fact that Hafter had guys who were coming into, this JV season already having a year of varsity experience with some consistent playing time already under their belt. And then you have the guys who didn't win a championship in their 8th grade year, but come in as 9th graders this year, and guys on the front end like Jacob Stern, and also a guy like Jared Pollock, a guy also on the opposite end, on the back end, like Cooper Sowell. These were all guys who really played big roles for their middle school team in 8th grade and came into their 9th grade season, and it really translated well for them. And I have to tip my cap to them. First of all, also, not first of all, but in addition, their coaching staff did a great job with Z Levy and Ben Newmark. They were both absolutely outstanding, really got the most out of these guys for how much experience they had playing on the JV level, because not all of them played JV none of them played JV last year. Bringing them all back, even though it sort of slows down a little bit when you go from varsity to JV, you do have to sort of retransition to the guys you're playing against because they know what you're coming with now. And they did a phenomenal job. And even more so, as I'm not going to get too deep into it, but Hafter's middle school this year had a good mix of 7th and 8th graders, although a little more 8th graders than 7th. And they just won the championship. And they didn't just win the championship. They had a perfect season. And now those guys are going to come into the mix next year as 9th graders with a very deep and talented 9th grade class from this past year. And I don't see any reason why they shouldn't at the very least be one of the favorites to win it all next year on the JV level. So that is all for Hafter. Moving on, we're going to talk about the DRS Wildcats, the runner-ups of the league overall. DRS finished with a final record of 8-2 during the regular season. Their only 2 losses came to SAR and also losing one to Hafter during the regular season. DRS was really, really strong all season long, though. And although they didn't win the championship, they stuck by that motto of we're going to play defense first. And that's going to be our main focus because DRS has always been about playing defense. And they've always been similar to, I mentioned, TABC's always at the very least expected to be competitive. Always the same case with a school like DRS. And especially, it shows in the record, they go 8-2 and they won in all different types of ways. They won, obviously, they had some blowout wins against teams maybe a little bit towards the bottom of the league. But they won some close games. They had to win in comeback fashion. I mentioned they were down 2-0 at home against TABC and score 3 consecutive unanswered goals to take the lead and hang on against a good, not necessarily like result-wise, record-wise in TABC, but a good TABC team that battled hard all season long. And even in the games they didn't win, they played close with SAR. They played close with Hafter. The one game they lost to Hafter, it was a 1-0 shutout in DRS, and Matty Blonder had the game of his life. DRS had chances all night long. They just couldn't find the bounce, couldn't find a way to get a ball past him. They were really right there, even in the games that they lost. It only happened twice during the regular season. And then in the semifinals, they get that same Hafter team that just beat them in their own building, let alone a couple weeks ago. And they find a way after being down 2 different times. First, they go down 1-0, then they go down 2-1. They find a way to find the equalizer late in regulation, make it 2-2, get a bounce early in overtime. And I mentioned Hafter had a really good mix of 9th and 10th graders. DRS didn't initially start with that great mix or didn't find that great mix right away. But especially in the playoffs, when it mattered the most, they got contributions from their freshman class. They had Eitan Rogoff chip in with the overtime winning goal in the semifinal game. They had Sam Goldstoff, who really hadn't seen so much time all season long until that game, get into the game, get the game tying goal in the semifinals, which gave DRS life and a chance to move on, which they eventually capitalized on. And with that being said, there were still guys, obviously, on the 10th grade level. I mentioned the likes of Josh Lampert, Zevi Fuchs, and Ami Marks all season long during previous episodes. And even, just in general, watching this team play and thinking about what makes this Titan tick or what made this DRS team tick. And that was a big reason for it. And obviously, Daniel Wohlglinter, who was great in goal for them and really turned a lot of heads, because I think a lot of people did not think, after not having much experience last season with Josh Papilski really taking control of the net for DRS last year, and Wohlglinter not really seeing any time, that he was going to get used to the amount of playing time and the angles and the movement, all of that stuff as fast as he did. But really got to give credit to him and got to tip your cap to him, because he was absolutely outstanding. And just for reference, in his first 3 games, he had 3 consecutive shutouts. So really just showed a lot of how well he was able to adjust and how hard he really worked to get to that point. So with that being said, that's all for DRS. And although they fell a little bit short, or rather not necessarily that's all, but the closing point for them is that although they did fall a little bit short during the regular season, or not during the regular season, during the season, they lost in the championship. It was still a very successful regular season for them, successful season for them overall, and with a good core of 9th graders coming in from their middle school team in Hal, which just made it to the championship, similar to Hafter, as I mentioned, and a good past year of 9th graders who played, as I mentioned, the likes of Rogoff and Goldstoff, who saved their best for the semifinal game in the championship. We know where they'll be looking to next year, and it'll definitely be interesting to see what happens with them. So that wraps it up for all we have on DRS. And then finally, moving on to the SAR Sting. SAR finished with a regular season record of 9-0-1, and they had the most points of any team during the regular season in the league. They finished with 19. They actually had a perfect point percentage. That one game, or rather, that one in the standings that was not a win, was a tie to Frisch. Frisch was the only team that managed to take a point from SAR all season long. However, let it be known, SAR had that in mind when they played them again. And SAR had beaten Frisch in Frisch and then tied them in SAR, then played the semifinal game, and that was their last game of the season. So they were really playing sort of a bet, for them at least, because Frisch had a YDE game in between. But SAR was playing a back-to-back almost, so to speak, against Frisch. And SAR was able to go over their mistakes, anything that really led to them not being able to complete their perfect season during the regular season, at least, and that didn't, translate in the win column for them. They were able to capitalize. They were able to clean it all up. They come in to a game that a lot of people thought was going to be a good game, myself included, and went right down to the wire. In the last couple of minutes of regulation, they score. They go up 1-0. That holds as the final score for the rest of the semifinal game. They go on to the championship, and it really, right off the start, I was there. I was announcing the game, and it just seemed right off the rip like SAR just had control. And, very shortly into the game, they score. They get another one late at the end of the first period after, they withstood the DRS push in the third period. Get a highlight reel goal from Jack Linhart, Nate Zitter with a hat trick on the regular, not on the regular season, in the championship game for them. Although I'm sure he probably had a hat trick somewhere in the regular season, if not multiple ones. And again, this team was just so loaded with talent, but it was not like they only relied on their talent. They were well coached. Jacob Schwartzman did a great job getting his players to buy into that system. And I mentioned Hafter and DRS had good mixes of 9th and 10th graders. That's what I really think the most easily identifiable, common denominator between the top 3 teams in the league that finished during the regular season, which were SAR, DRS, and Hafter, and 1, 2, 3 in that order, were that they all had a really solid mix of 9th and 10th grade players. And SAR obviously had their big guns in the 10th grade class of Jack Linhart and Nate Zitter and Jacob Rosenstein and Michael Goldman in net. But they also had some really excellent freshmen come in and play roles, guys like Jack Duche, guys like Adine Cattler, Jonah Neowitz. There's your core right there for next year. And, with another deep, large class of 9th graders incoming which will be next year's 9th graders. So 8th graders this year that are incoming 9th graders for next year. They will certainly be, or I would have to at the very least, assume that they should be back in the mix coming off a championship, the first championship that they've won on the JV level since 2015, or really, I guess, 2020, when they were crowned co-champions with TABC. That was the year that COVID shut the rest of the season down. But they'd already taken their spot in the championship. And with that being said, it's going to be very interesting to see what happens with them. If they'll be able to repeat as champions next year, we'll just have to wait. But for now, that's all on the JV recap for the 2023-24 MYHSAL JV hockey season. And again, I want to thank everyone for tuning into this episode of Yeshiva League Pass Faceoff. And reminder, everyone, again, we are sponsored by the Weiselberg Law Firm. Please choose wisely.